Hello, friends, and welcome back to yet another episode of the Wizard Factory podcast, where you subscribe for weekly videos exploring deeper knowledge of the universe and yourself. Back again for part 2 of the Dark Crystal Allegorical breakdown. My name is Logan Hart.
And I'm Brian Easterday.
And joining us again is Susan Aurora, my lovely life partner, to tackle part 2 of this allegorical breakdown, our very first one. Obviously, if you haven't watched part 1 yet, go ahead and do that, because we're pretty much just going to pick up right where we left off. And again, as we said last time, make sure you go and actually watch the movie so that you can get the most out of this episode. If you're new to this channel, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You know, we'd be happy to have you, and give us a like as well. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So we ended the last segment where the Gartham showed up at the Pod People village and started just abducting fools left and right, you know, taking them back to the castle. And Jen and Kira and Fizzgig barely make their escape. And then you see Jen is really taking that heart, you know, on himself. He's feeling the weight of that personal responsibility of, like, he's the hero on his hero's journey now. He's found the shard, which we've said, you know, represents himself. It's the microcosmic fractal of truth, and symbolically he blames himself, and then he says, I wish I've never found this shard, representing found myself, found my personal responsibility, my sovereignty, and he chucks it away. And so we're beginning part 2 here, where you see Jen and Kira asleep in the woods, and Jen is dreaming. And he's dreaming of his master, his teacher, you know, his basically what was his sort of foster father, the mystic, the wisest mystic. And he's talking about, he still doesn't see himself as a hero yet. He's on the journey, he's going through the actions, but he doesn't believe it himself. It's kind of like in the Matrix, when Morpheus is waiting for Neo to realize he's the one. He's kind of at that stage of, like, he's not there yet. He's on the journey, but he hasn't quite arrived. But this is definitely a turning point for the character, because he's talking about, you know, he's almost talking to his master and saying, you know, I miss the old days. I miss how the simplicity of how things were before. Really, he's noting the loss of his innocence, basically. And,
yeah, he says, I'm not a hero, not the way you wanted me to be.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I miss how things were before. It's kind of like we can all think back to our childhoods, where life was very simple, and you could just build things or play with toys, or just go run around or ride bicycles in your neighborhood, you know, whatever it is, you know. It's a two-edged sword, I guess you could say. Growing up, you know, you lose that part of yourself. You gain more, though. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to go back to childhood. I like being an adult, but with that comes responsibility. And that's why essentially a lot of people choose to, or think that they choose to, stay a spiritual infant and never take that on.
Yeah, I totally agree. When he says, master, nothing is simple anymore, that's exactly how I perceived it as well, was that journey of growing up. And, you know, we talked about that whole ignorance is bliss. The idea, it reminds me of Cypher from the Matrix when he's eating the steak. And he says, I know the steak isn't real, but it's good anyway. And Jen is very much going through this rite of passage into, you know, losing not only his innocence, but his ignorance. And with great power comes great responsibility, was a big theme that I saw within that transition. And it's interesting that he was doing that while he was asleep. Like, it was, you know, this dream that he was having, and then he awakes to this whole new world.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't considered that, the fact that he gets the message, like, in the dream world, and then he kind of has to, like, wake up from that and then bring that into the real world, like, into action. You know, and I think, I believe it was in the the dream, like there was something said it that I jotted it down really quickly, but I didn't catch the whole thing. But there's an interesting statement where it was like, two made one by Gelfling's hand or by none,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's very interesting in the sense of looking at our, it always comes back to that personal responsibility. Like even in our own world, if we want to fix it, like we want to heal ourselves, like we are the ones that have to go unite the shard within ourselves, so to speak. So I think that's a very, very interesting thing to note, that he gets, that reminder of that self-responsibility, which in kind of almost in a reframing way, because that's why he was kind of feeling down, as he was feeling the weight of that responsibility. Like he didn't want that, but then, kind of that reframing and that reminder of like, well, that you have to be the one to do it. Sometimes that kind of, that reminder is really useful in being able to carry on the journey, because it does get discouraging sometimes in the process of becoming more aware of things, and finding yourself. There's a lot of very discouraging moments for sure. It's definitely not all rainbows and sunshine by any means.
Right, and it's kind of the irony of this idea that you have a choice whether you like it or not. Like you don't have a choice about whether you have a choice. Like that responsibility comes with literally, like we said before, having a consciousness and free will to take action and create change in reality.
It's interesting because Jen even says, safe. I don't think anywhere is safe anymore, because it's like we said, that truth, like the crystal shows to everyone, the truth, is objective, and there is nowhere, he's not safe from it anywhere anymore. Now that he has the knowledge, he can't run away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a very good point.
So the next part is, Jen, you're a wake up, from this, where Jen is dreaming and they're sleeping next to each other, and they wake up and they realize they're right next to the ruins of the ancient, where you see in real time in the series, this is what they're exploring, is the ruins of the world that was from the past, before the Gelfling completely eradicated by the Skeksis, or more specifically by the Garthim. Of course, the Order followers did it, not the rulers themselves. And they find these ruins, which this is, I think, one of the more powerful symbolic portions of the movie, because they find the ruins of their ancestors. It's the last remnants of the old world that has been destroyed by the ruling class, the Skeksis in this case. And the signs of this is all over the place. In fact, the first place they open the door into is this sort of a throne room where there's a Trinity symbol. And this is something, as we've talked about already, this is, I think, one of the most important symbolic themes, I guess you could say, within the movie and the series, of triality, bringing the masculine and feminine, that duality, into alignment and synthesis. It's not a this or that, yin yang is the duality aspect, but the Trinity represents triality, where you're still incorporating the masculine and feminine. They still have their individual form, but then you're bringing them together into a third through aligned action. And this is, again, it's on the throne itself, which to me, it symbolizes, what is the throne but a seat of power? They're looking at the last vestiges of this old world, where they had mastered that balance. And the reason that the world has gone asunder now is because things are so out of whack. Thra is hurting, the divine feminine is in danger. And this is kind of showing you this is what we've lost. These are the ruins of the world past, where the triality was in balance and had been mastered.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that the same Trinity that you're mentioning is present on the throne and around the ruins is also the same symbol that is on Kira's dress. It's upside down, but it's on her dress over her heart. And I noticed that it kind of looked like 3 yonis or leaves or hearts, but there was this definitive shape in the middle that it did represent, like you said, the loss of the feminine. And, Jen says, I can feel something, hear it almost. That's what he says when they walk into the ruins.
Right, and it's interesting too that Kira literally goes and sits on that throne. It's interesting that they had the female character go sit on the throne, and not to mention, just as a reminder or foreshadowing, when we get into the series, that the old world was matriarchal. All Madras were women that were the rulers. So that female definitely had the divine feminine, I should say, definitely had a strong presence.
Well, that. Okay, so it was really interesting in the sense that using the runes themselves. I mean, the fact that you could see that as a perfect allegorical representation of like what had happened to the world. They're, like Logan was saying, they seeing the runes of the loss of their ancestors, of this, the loss of their power, and like where they actually had everything in balance. And as we see, on the runes, they're very, again, a lot of the spirals and things like that, like we talked about in the first episode, where in the home of the mystics, in their cave, it was like that. So it was very much that kind of natural, the very natural patterns. What Logan and I have talked about on the show a lot is like, pagans, they create spirals and circles and things like that, whereas monotheism is all about building the blocks and the squares, and things like that. So I find that's very interesting. And and I think that's, he's on this journey of finding himself, and then, he's doubting himself in the previous scene, has a dream or, a communication experience with his guide, the wise one, which is kind of reminding him of that responsibility. And then right after that, the next step in the journey, I think it's very interesting, is finding the ruins of his ancestors. And I think that really is a great representation of part of that journey of discovering ourselves, is discovering like where we came from and things like that, so that can be a representation of encountering your ancestral knowledge and lineage and awakening blood codes and things within yourself. So there's a lot of symbolism in the scene. It's a very interesting one to look at and pay attention to.
Right, it's like that quote about the cutting a tree off from its roots or something like that, of like having that knowledge of like where you came from, like you said, but also the knowledge of the ancients, like having that passed down. And that's something that we very much lost as well, is just the general understandings that they had and how they lived in harmony and in tune with things. We're very discordant with nature now. And the next, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in the ruins did actually, the pictographs, there was almost like hieroglyphs. It did very much look like, our own ancestors, past civilizations, ways that they recorded things that were important information. And I really like the fact that the movie gave us so many little clues and so much richness to give us the series, because somebody probably went back and watched the movie, noticed Kira sitting on the throne, and noticed the Almadra within these hieroglyphs, and took a page from that. So I think that's also very interesting how rich just this one movie was to give all of these clues for the series.
That's a great point. One, it's interesting that on there the glyphs, or the information is being recorded on the stone. So I think that's kind of very interesting in itself, especially getting into actual megaliths and things. You see a lot of them are made of quartz. They store information. There's something stored there, and I think that could be a lot of what they were alluding to when Jin's saying he's like he isn't sure what it is, but he can feel it, or he can hear it, or he can sense it in a way that place is, even though it seems like it's in total ruins, that power, that information, that knowledge, that memory is still like stored there and accessible.
Yeah, and then those hieroglyphics, the showing, and you can see here in the screenshot, the crystal castle, which it looks like a hand reaching for an eye, which I thought, it's like the sun or knowledge, like the light of truth, like it's reaching for that. And then you have these the beings surrounding the crystal, which you can tell by the end that these are the beings that you see when the mystics and Skeksis are reintegrated together. This is what they looked like before the crystal was cracked and split in two. And then you have the Skeksis on one side that are running towards the crystal, and then the mystics are going the other way on the other side of the image there. So it's like the crystal in this is also, it's clear. It's the previous, the way it looked at in the, you know, even you say metaphorically, does that make sense? Oh yeah, it's crystal clear. Like the truth is uncorrupted. It's very clear. And then, Kira asks Jen about the writing, and he says, he calls them words that stay. I thought that was really interesting, in that he learned that from his master. You know, my master told me. It's really, he says it really funny. We were having a laugh about that, but and then he reads the inscription, and it says, "When single shines the triple sun." This is, you had alluded to this quote earlier, Brian, which represents integration. Single shines the triple sun. There's that triality all being brought into focus, which you'll see in the actual Great Conjunction. You have that triangle with all three suns in the center. What was sundered and undone shall be whole, the two made one, by Gelfling hand or by none. Which again, as I mentioned in the last episode, my theory is that the Gelflings really, represent humanity and that sovereign being, that fully balanced. Like I said, their symbol was depicted by that trinity of like everything in balance. And if you're looking at from the sovereignty perspective, that would be like the non-aggression principle and the self-defense principle brought in, having proper turizage, proper boundaries. That's what is required in order to maintain one's sovereignty.
Well, I believe that, and I'm just now making this connection, if you can believe it. But what you're saying, the Gelfling represent humanity, and that struggle and that journey that we have to make towards sovereignty. But then we see this story as this very mystical, magical thing. But the Skeksis obviously represent government elites, and the mystics represent spirituality, religion, even though in my personal opinion, I think that the mystics are these beautiful creatures. They are very, like we've talked about, right-brained, very almost like this monk mentality of like, complete selflessness and complete unconditional love and complete self-sacrifice. Right. But
a lack of action. Like they have very much taken a position of being passive and just sort of like letting things be what they are, which is the imbalanced feminine of just like let's face it, this is what the New Age agenda is all about, is, oh yeah, just meditate and think positive thoughts and don't actually, fight evil. Don't actually take action to make change. Just focus on the internal.
Yeah, they represent these two beings that in this world are above the Gelflings, above the humans on the food chain. We look to them for guidance. We look to religion and we look to government for guidance, for rules, for control. And even though the Gelfling didn't really ask for that, that's the situation that was born from the split, from the duality that's created in that world through the loss of knowledge, of truth.
Well, and I think it's, interesting to note that even though the Gelfling, perceive that, they have to look to these other beings, as being, above them, so to speak, when you really look at it, like just like that little prophecy alluded to, it has to be united by Gelfling's hand or by none. So these beings were so split and divided in themselves that they couldn't do it themselves. There was a bigger task that, the Gelfling had to do, the ones who were, closer, like they were part of Thra, because we noticed that these other beings, they weren't from Thra, they came from somewhere else. So there wasn't that connection there. So even though they were the ones that fractured the crystal, they didn't have the ability or that connection to the planet itself to be able to heal it. That's very interesting to look at. So, so then we see, while they're in the runes, Skexel, or the Chamberlain, he kind of approaches them, and he, is feigning friendship, and just being, very, very kind, sneaky and, obviously, a shady ass character for sure.
Yes.
Yeah,
Stay, Fred.
Yeah.
He's like, prophecy caused this.
Yeah, he's sort of copping out and making it seem like, oh, it's all the prophecy. Like, Skeksis aren't bad. We were afraid of Gelfling. They, we were afraid that the Gelfling would destroy us or whatever.
Right, yeah. So, and then, he's trying to convince them to, come with him or whatever. And obviously, he has his own plan or agenda in that, and being able to get back in within his own, circle of the Skeksis. So, but I think that's really representative of, we can see on our journey, sometimes you encounter characters or temptations or things like that, they may seem like they're a very good offer, or someone may be doing that, but that person actually may not have your best interest in mind, or that may be something that's actually would lead you away from your path. So, it's interesting to note that there are going to be those challenges or those temptations on our own journey of self-discovery, and that, we need to be careful and aware of that. And, I think, obviously they follow their intuition. I think that's one of the keys in them, not going with him, is that, intuitively it didn't feel correct. And that's, what it really comes back down to, is being able to use your intuition to stay in alignment with yourself and where you need to go on your journey.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting that you said that, because even more specifically, it was Jin who was kind of hearing him out, and obviously he's like, he wants peace, so he's gonna he wants to kind of look at the logic of what the Skeksis is telling him, like, we'll come back to the castle. He's being reasonable, or trying to be reasonable, and he's thinking about it, and then it was Kira, the feminine, the intuition, that says, don't listen to him, it's a trick. And then he's just like, no. He says the powerful word, the word of power, the lost word, no. And that's when Skeksil's like, please come back, please. Like, he starts freaking out and everything.
Yeah, it's funny, he has zero chill, because he's like chasing them, going, please make peace. And it's like he's literally yelling at them and chasing them to make peace. It was so funny.
It's like that desperation of a parasite when it sees it's like its food source going away. Like with a narcissist, and they have someone that they've been like kind of keeping under their control, and then they start to see that person taking power back, and then they try to get their lives back. That person will, they just kind of freak out. They get just immediate extreme reaction, is what they're feeding on. Their life source is going away, and to that's then, bringing up their true fear, which is that of non-existing, non-death.
Well, think about it. It's because they're the ones that are codependent. It's like they gaslight you into thinking that they have all the power, and they need, you need them, or else you'd be nothing without them. But actually, once you start realizing your sovereignty, taking your power back, it's them who starts kind of losing their chill, like Susan said, about it's revealed to you that actually they're the ones that need you, and you don't need them, and then you just cut them off.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's very interesting to note, for sure.
Well, and what really confused me about even what he said coming in, he says, the prophecy caused this. It was a bad mistake, and the Skeksis did it out of fear. But what I noticed was that the prophecy just says to become one. It doesn't ever threaten the Skeksis directly. It's threatening their existence individually, because, I don't know if they understand that they're split, and I don't know if they know. It doesn't really say. But the prophet's all smoke and mirrors, what he's doing. And I agree with what you reflected about that, because the prophecy actually doesn't directly threaten the Skeksis. So I thought it was funny that, nobody ever logically said, why would you be scared? What were you afraid of?
Yeah, they're afraid of coming out of that imbalanced position. It's like when a person, they get dogmatic and they're stuck in a black and white position, like we talked about before. They're afraid to come out of that position, because that's really ego death.
That's really ironic, isn't it? That even with the crystal becoming heal and the two become one, it threatens the Skeksis as an individual, but they don't die. They just get reintegrated into their whole form. So man, that
their true self.
Thought about that. That's really really powerful.
Yeah, that's good.
So
Right.
next in the story, we have Kira that calls the Landstriders to take them to the castle. So they're, they're beginning, they have the shard back. They know where they're going. They know what they have to do, because that's when, that's the point they realize when they're reading those hieroglyphs of like, oh, that's what we're supposed to do. We have to heal the crystal. So Kira, you see Kira's attunement with nature. She has a command of nature. She can call in her animal friends to aid them on their journey. And the feminine is coming as a companion to Jin. The prophecy didn't say anything about this, but as they're running, he's kind of joking. The prophecy didn't say anything about this, and then Jin says, "Prophets don't know everything," and that also kind of, because we talked about in part one, Agra, she said, he asked her which shard is it, and she said, "I don't know." Just because somebody has wisdom doesn't mean they know everything. And in fact, now that I'm saying that, it kind of makes me laugh, because so many times in my posting on social media and having conversations about the importance of truth and all this kind of stuff, people that are stuck in their victim mentality and their solipsistic worldview, they say things like, well, you just can't know everything. And that's such a fallacy, because I never said just because you can know something or just you can have truth doesn't mean you know everything. It just means some things are true.
Well, and what's interesting about that statement is, like, with, prophets don't know everything. If you can look at even, using astrology, you can see conjunctions and shifts and certain events coming up. So you can see energetically what's going to happen or the potential for what's there. But that doesn't mean you know how it's going to actually play out. It plays out in a very beautiful, a very kind of poetic way. But I also think it's interesting that whenever Kira calls in the Landstriders, keeping in mind that it was their intuition that, they chose to say no to the Chamberlain and then go away. If we're looking at the rune Awaj, it means horse. It's all about, like, riding your intuition like a horse. So, and then I think it's very interesting that they kind of call in what Thraw's version of the horse would be in order to carry them away from that.
The feminine is the one that calls it.
That calls it in. So I thought that was kind of an interesting little correlation there.
Mm-hmm. So, this next section definitely. Oh, Susan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, it was about the next part is when they're actually leaving. And I didn't want to skip over that, because, they get on the Landstriders, and she's like, "Let's go." And Jen says, "You don't have to go." And she says, "I know." And then Jen says, "All right, together then." And that was, and that was a really important moment that stood out to me a lot, because there was this moment he had, "All right, alone then," where he had to do the journey himself to find himself. And then once he did, then this divine feminine comes in, and, there's, this connection that happens, and the balance of the masculine and feminine is then restored, like they stayed the night together. He had this dream. He woke up in the ruins to this ancestral prophecy, and they go from alone then to together then. And so then the journey takes this shift.
Right. And that really goes with that theme of like bringing into the parts of yourself that have been fractalized and disconnected, and bringing it back in and integrating it and becoming a whole and complete, the damn Trinity. That's really, like, to me, one of the central themes of the entire story.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, like this next part, like I said, is pretty rich, but in a very dark way. So this is where it shows the Skeksis are harvesting the podling essence, and there's a lot of aspects to this. First of all, first thing you see is all these caged creatures, really depicting that dominator mindset. Lack of respect of sovereignty and freedom and nature. Everything's just something to be commoditized and exploited. And then you see they're strapping the podling to the chair, and the Skeksis is saying, "We don't want to hurt you, we just want to drain your living essence. Then you can be the same as the others here, a slave." That's literally what he says to the podling. And again, as we've mentioned before, I think there's something very childlike and innocent about podlings. So not only does that to me, kind of allude to the pedophilic culture of the elites and the way that they abuse children for literally like energy harvesting and physical draining of adrenochrome, but also symbolically as that inner child of ourselves, and also another aspect of the feminine, which is that innocence, that sort of loving, unconditional, could be naive, but not inherently, but without the masculine could be a little bit imbalanced. But, it's that part, it's what they do to us in school. They crush that sense of your inner child. And I think that's what this is implying here. We don't want to hurt you. We just want to drain your living essence. You can be the same as the others, a slave. They're ridding them of that. And I also think it could be a bit of sort of their individuality, because what else does the school system do but create cogs in the machine, just, blocks in the pyramid, bricks in the wall, as it were. And then he says, feel the power of the dark crystal, this hierarchical system of masters and slaves. Slaves think that they're masters too, like they're given small positions of power and authority. Some jerk off that's a supervisor or a low-level police sergeant or something like that. You guys, that's a lot already. So you guys want to riff on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting that they're draining their life essence, and if you almost look at it like the soul, or whatever, they're taking their and what lights your soul? It's your passions, it's your spirits, that's the connection to Thra. And then not only are they using them for that, but they still want to use them after. So even this statement, it's a total gaslighted statement that he says, that we don't want to hurt you. No, you just want to parasitically feed his life essence and then turn him into a slave that you can then use and abuse later on as well. So it's a very, it just really shows you that kind of predator, that psychopathic mindset of how, they're a person like that is never going to want to help you. Like they're only ever going to use you and continue to use
parasites
and until something, makes them stop. And you see the podlings' eyes, the ones that have been draining the slaves, they're kind of, you can see like the glows just kind of out of their eyes. They have this very just plain dead,
gray, dead, like cataract looking eyes. Yeah.
And it's interesting enough, as we mentioned before, the eyes are being the gateway to the soul. So you kind of see that the life is just drained out of them. So there's a lot of symbolism in there. And, I think one of them they're talking to, it's like, I can't remember which character it is, but they're saying, you're very lucky slave. Like, only the emperor gets to drink your essence. Like that, that slave should be happy to, he's getting fed on by the emperor of all of them. He's not just getting fed on by anybody. Right. It's like a special privilege. Yeah, exactly. I thought that was something that, it really stuck out to me. Me. Them saying that.
And then he says, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
And then he says, the beam will rid you of your fears, your thoughts, your vital essence, which again, kind of, that individuality, like and domestication as well. Like, oh, don't worry, don't have any fears or thoughts of your own, just kind of conform and we'll take care of your every need and all that kind of thing. What were you going to say, Susan?
I was just going to reflect that I also think, that's funny because we're talking about the reflector, but this scene is more evidence of that theme of technology, the medical age of advancements. I even kind of saw like Third Reich themes and the whole having the animals in cages and the experiments and the machines and all of the advancements. Like they are actually really, intelligent when it comes to these matters, and they're able to harness this energy and do all these amazing things. But it's that corruption of knowledge without the heart, without the care, greed and power fueling that knowledge. It can still be gained, but it's corrupted. And there are a lot of very phallic and metaphorical things, like you said, with the reflector. And he even says the great shaft of the castle when he's talking to the podling about.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, exactly. Well, especially if you're thinking of the crystal as like, a soul essence, or the the heart of Thra, and then it being trapped within that masculine energy, that phallic
The
symbol.
shaft.
That's yeah. I mean, that's very
Mhm.
definitely very symbolic. For sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and then you see the Emperor drinking the essence. So it's not just that they're draining the podlings, it's for their own consumption. And ironically, it's for vitality and youth. So again, there's sort of this dual symbolism of not only like a very literal interpretation of adrenochrome, like they're harvesting that energy and consuming it for their own, vitality and stuff like that, drinking their blood, all that stuff. But also it's sort of stealing that youthful aspect of themselves that they are lacking. They're spiritually dead, and so they have to. And you notice when he drinks it, he feels great for a second, and then the effects wear off quickly, and he gets enraged. He tells Skektek that like it's a trick, or like this is bogus essence or something like that. And then he said, well, like it always works better with Gelfling, Gelfling essence, because I think it's also that balanced, the Gelfling is like the balanced human being, whereas the Podling is sort of that just sort of naive, innocent inner child as well.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of that movie Death Becomes Her. I don't know if you remember that movie, but they have this essence. It actually looks very similar to how it does in the Dark Crystal. It's this glowing essence, and it makes you look younger, but you're still falling apart on the inside. And these women that drink it still have to take care of their bodies, because they'll just start falling apart if they don't. So there's that temporary, on the surface or momentary feeling of vitality that they get from it. But it's, even with the Gelfling, it's only temporary. They have to continue to provide that for themselves.
And one side note as well about this scene is that you see Aughra is encaged as well, which to me, she more than anyone in the story itself represents that motherly care. Whereas Kira is more like the intuition and like that even keel. It's the divine feminine. Aughra is in a cage in the very same chamber where they're draining the essence and stuff, and she's like kind of helpless to do anything about it. She's caring for them and she weeps for them, but yet she's encaged.
Well, and it's interesting, that like Susan was saying, the Skeksis, their power comes from like these mechanical tools. Like they're very left brain, very they're good at science and figuring these things out. But where they ultimately have to get their power from is either from the crystal or from the beings of Thra, that which is more natural. They have to pretty much go after and rob nature
it's the
or
ether.
something. Yeah, exactly. So and I think that's very symbolic of like what a lot of very large corporations or things like in obviously America's like thirst for oil and things like that, all going out there and having to take from nature or cutting down forest or any other way that we're exploiting the planet in a very unhealthy way just to fuel greed and power. It's not it's in a relationship that's out of balance, because there is a balance in existing on the planet and just taking what you need. But then when it goes into a level of just it's only for fueling greed and power, then it becomes very corrupted. It comes out of balance, and very parasitic rather than a symbiotic kind of relationship.
Exactly. Yeah, so the next scene is where Jen and Kira are arriving at the castle. They ride in on the Landstriders, and they see the Garthian there bringing in the podlings that they just got done abducting from the village earlier, and they're just now getting there. So they come in, and again, it's Kira who sort of like leads the charge. She gets really enraged. And I think that's really powerful, is it's that fierceness of the feminine through an act of care, like Kali, again, with that sort of very fearsome but feminine, powerful energy. They fight, they come in and they fight and free them. The Landstriders actually get killed in the process, taking down the Garthim, but they were able to free the podlings and let them go. And then they float down into an underground tunnel, and you see that Kira has wings. This is the first time ever that you're realizing that female, gelflings have wings, which, to me, that's, again, that sort of feminine, spiritual, like they can take flight. Masculine is grounded, and feminine is sort of, they call it airy fairy, right? Kind of up in the stardust and everything. And then they literally climb into the mouth of a demon when entering the castle. It's like into the belly of the beast sort of thing. And again, they're now in this cavern beneath the castle, which is very feminine. So you have the castle itself, which is phallic, but beneath that, just like in metaphysics, beneath the masculine is that depths of the feminine. In this case, a cavern, which, it's like the lagouge, there's dripping water, and you kind of hear that flowing water down there. But it's very kind of unpleasant place. In fact, Kira literally says, "I smell death here," which it's almost like they're in this rotten yoni or something. Like it's this kind of, it's the feminine beneath the castle. It's very rancid and kind of diseased and old and, in need of healing and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, to me, that it's interesting that you mentioned lagouge, because that's definitely what I thought of whenever I was watching the scene. Not only because of the water, but the fact that they're entering into the castle, like beneath the castle. So that's really, to me, hinting on the unconscious mind, which is something that lagouge as a rune really deals with a lot, is those deep waters, those deep emotions. And, you can see it as needing to ride your emotions, ride your care into that castle, because going and, cleansing it is going to be, quite a process, quite a dangerous journey. As we see in the movie, this building up, this is really like the part in the movie where they're getting ready to face the most danger. It's kind of, everything's building up to this. So it's very interesting that, when you're going on your own journey of self-discovery, it takes a lot of care to be willing to drift into your own unconscious mind and see everything there that's rancid and that needs fixed, or like here says, that smell of death, that what's rotten down there, it's been stagnant. So that's a very, very interesting scene to look at in that way.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the journey, just even though it's just a few short scenes, that they go from being on the surface, and as Logan pointed out, Kira is the one that runs, Hart first into the charge, and Jen's kind of like, huh? Like he's kind of, it takes him a minute to catch up with her. And I noticed the podlings were crying like babies. So there's very much this maternal, divine mother energy, like the whole idea that like mothers will do anything to protect their children. And these little podlings are literally like making these baby sounds. Ooh. She comes in and saves them, risks the horses, the landstriders in the act. And then the very next scene is them floating down on wings, which, as we know, wings are very, representative. And in lore, they represent fairies and angels. Winged creatures kind of live between worlds. So it's interesting that they used her wings to travel from, this divine feminine moment of motherhood and, her rescuing the podlings to this corrupted, toxic feminine cavern. And the wings being wings are also like, winged creatures are like liaisons to the divine. That's why they have this very spiritual, magical, celestial connection. And there's that high and low, the mind and body aspect of that. Just that little short scene is so, representational of what they're doing and the continuation on the journey.
That's an excellent point.
Fantastic feedback there. Yeah, like you were saying, it's kind of that angry mama bird. Like everybody knows you don't want to piss off mama. It's that angry, enraged feminine, but it's coming from that place of care. It's not toxic. It's not to control and dominate. It's actually about freedom. Like she sees her babies are being, mistreated, and kind of comes in. So now they're in the depths, and again, Skeksil approaches them, and this time he's not so nice, and he tries to just basically like, I knew you'd come. And then he tries to take them, and ironically, Jin stabs his hand with a crystal shard. So, you know, the shard can be a weapon. Think about that thurizage is a thorn. It's like that. That's what that represented to me, was that thorn of self-defense, of like, he's not a violent person. He's defending himself. And again, with the shard representing his own sovereignty, it's his personal boundaries. It's his thurizage that he then attacks Skeksil with, and his hand starts bleeding. And then you see the mystic, his hand starts bleeding as well. So then you're seeing that sort of mirror of the beings that are intertwined spiritually.
I loved what they said, because Skeksil says, "Ow, my hand," and the mystic says, "So my hand."
And so my hand, yeah.
And so my hand. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, one that's very interesting too is showing that, you know, hinting on the thurizage, or that it being your son's stuff. But if you're also looking at the crystal as a allegory for truth, that, you know, that truth can be used very much like a weapon. You know, if someone's attacking you, sometimes that sting of truth is sharp enough to actually get that attacker then to leave you alone. You know, so that's also very another way to look at it for sure.
Absolutely, that's great. And then, so, you know, Chamberlain then sort of retaliates by collapsing the ceiling into this cavern, and you see Jen kind of get thrown asunder, and he abducts or apprehends Kira. So again, you at this point you have a very strong theme of the divine feminine is in trouble. Kira is now in the hands of the Skeksis. Aughra is now in the cage, and now the cave, the feminine cave, is collapsed. So to me, that, you know, all of those things happening in conjunction sort of really pointed to that.
That's interesting too, because you could see that, you know, like on your journey as you're being tested, a lot of times you could see your care starting to collapse, or you know, you'll see people that, you know, like, oh, I wish I didn't do this. You know, it's kind of like much like the test where we started at the beginning of the episode, where you kind of chuck the shard away. This is, you know, another representation of, you know, our care that could be, you know, in trouble. That, you know, it's very important to, you know, keep that protected and guarded.
Right. It's like Mark Passio talks about when doing the great work is about sustained willpower. It's not just about, oh, I did a thing, pat myself on the back. You got to be, you know, committed through the thick and the thin, and keep that care, you know, intact.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this scene brought up a whole new theme for me, because at the end, when, as you said, Jen was thrown asunder, he's trapped, and what we see is Fizzgig. You know, they're kind of being sad and mourning him, and, you know, I'd always kind of thought as Fizzgig, as, you know, Logan said, this fluffy ball of teeth, and it dawned on me that he in himself was an archetype, and that in other movies and shows that there's this theme of an animal companion that gets either left behind, you know, they're by their caregiver or steward, they're, you know, or they're somehow, even though they're just an animal companion, they are somehow rescuing or contributing to the journey.
Telling them something. It's like,
yes,
you know,
a premonition. Yes, like Lassie, or exactly, Toto. Yes, they're these emotional dogs, are very emotional, empathetic beings. So it's interesting that there would be this dog in this situation who is attached to Kira. And so I did a little research, and they call it the friendly beast archetype. And it's an animal who helps guide the hero where they're going and assists or saves the hero. And it, to me, it shows like nature's on your side. That's kind of this theme of that is, you know, they're very loyal, they're very fearless, and that all represents Fizzgig and nature itself. So that was interesting. I started to notice Fizzgig's, you know, contribution to the story after this point, because of that becoming aware.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, especially in like looking at the idea of like a you know, a familiar or some other, you know, animal friend that you have with you as a guide. That's, you know, because you definitely see that too, especially in a lot of like mythology, or even with a lot of the gods and things like that.
Like Odysseus' dog Argos. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a very interesting thing to note for sure.
So then Chamberlain shows up with Kira, and he's all proud of himself, and the Skeksis are all deathly afraid. They're very like taken aback, and that's indicative of humans of again that even though the elites seem to have the power, they both loathe and fear human beings because we're everything that they aren't. We have what they so badly possess, but they're so cut off from. And then I really thought it was interesting. The Chamberlain really kind of gets his hubris puffed up, and he's just like, I have done this. I have caught her. I bring your gelfling. And then he's like, I was wounded. I suffer horrible pain. That victim mentality of just kind of like, I did this, even though, oh, poor me, I was hurt, but I got you the gelfling. And then, they start sort of debating over what to do with her. We're sworn to kill the gelfling, says the ritual master, which is interesting because, he would be more familiar with the prophecy of the danger that she poses. And then, of course, the emperor says, no, first we drain her essence, then kill her. And, of course, then Chamberlain is restored of his status and his robes, and he's kind of given his restitution for this act. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, and, here soon, you see them kind of getting ready to, they're kind of at a place where they're preparing for the ritual of the conjunction, and they see the gelfling here. And like you said, they have kind of a very fearful reaction to her. And then all of a sudden, that fear, it immediately distracts them from what they were actually preparing for. Where, I think it's kind of interesting to note, we see that, the mystics, keeping in mind where they're at, being the other half, they're on their way to the castle. And in the movie, I won't get too far into it yet because we're not quite to that part, but they really show up with perfect timing, so to speak, with their like literally like perfect timing. So I think it's interesting that they're, focused and that they know where they need to be, but the other half of them, the Skeksis, get really distracted as soon as their fear gets triggered. And then all of a sudden they get off task, and that kind of sets up an opening for everything to play out.
Right. They're way off script here.
And then, of course, Kira is then strapped to the chair to be drained of her essence. And, this is where, as you mentioned, Susan, Jen is awakened from the rubble and immediately says, Kira, fight them. He's the masculine calling out to the feminine, fight back. Don't just, succumb to it, like resist. And Aughra, the mother, is in the cage in the same room, and she tells Kira to free the animals, to call the animals to freedom. So it's that using the power of the voice and communication with the different levels of the self, and to tap into the power of nature. She says, you have the gift, Kira. Call the animals to freedom. It's that reminder. And then, of course, she does. All the animals escape from the cages, which is, that sort of
slave
natural
revolt.
It's the backlash, the karmic backlash, because now they're sort of running out and destroying stuff, and the Skeksis are all freaking out, and then they actually attack Skektek, which I think represents transhumanism and that technological kind of like we've been talking about, very strong theme, but especially with embodied in this one Skeksis, which I think gets portrayed a lot stronger in the series as well. And you do notice he has a mechanical eye, which you actually see why later in the series, but for now, I mean, you still can see he's sort of that biotechnology sort of aspect. And then though he falls into the shaft, into the fire below, and then the corresponding mystic then bursts into flame and disappears.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's interesting that it's the animals that were caged and being abused, the nature that's being used, coming back and kind of lashing back out in a righteous way, and standing back up for itself, defending itself. So it's again getting back to this kind of theme of this technological enslavement versus this kind of natural world, meaning, you know, that Ra is starting to, at this point, you know, kind of wake up in the sense that, you know, the feminine has the gift to embody that. You know, and that's very, you know, interesting, because we see, you know, if you look in any indigenous culture, you know, the feminine, the women are very much the ones that are, you know, that mother archetype, but also make sure that there's that connection with the earth, you know, with nature, very much like being maintained and in balance. So yeah, definitely interesting to look at it from that perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. And then so the animals free Kira of the bindings. So then the nature is now freeing the feminine back. She called them to their freedom, and then they're in turn reciprocating, like kind of Gabo, and then Agra as well. So now both those feminine characters have been set free, and Agra says, "Too late. Great conjunction is at hand. The Skeksis will have power over the stars," which I thought was really interesting phrasing that she used. The Skeksis will have power over the stars, because it's sort of that technological, you know, the spiritual pursuit is a pilgrimage within, whereas the left brain imbalanced materialist is all about, well, we need to go out and explore space and colonize other planets and stuff like that. It's all about the out there. So, and then I guess one final plot point here we can get into, and then we'll probably end this as part 2, and we'll conclude next week with the final part 3. Is Jen gets up, you know, he's risen from the rubble, and then he immediately falls into the darkness. He slips and falls into an even deeper cave, which, you know, like Brian said, definitely a subconscious, unconscious mind, where he's going even deeper within the depths of his own self. And of course, what does he find as soon as he lands down there? There's all these Garthim around, and you hear you see the lights, the little, you know, purple lights of their eyes light up, and you hear that crabby clicking noise that they make, like that really kind of mechanical crabby sound, and they're surrounding him. It's almost like an ayahuasca trip or something, where you're faced with your own demons. Like the deeper you go into yourself, you're going into the darkness of your own, you know, psyche. And, you know, to me, that represents sort of the shadow self, as well as the programming that goes really deep all the way, you know, because the Garthim, again, represent order followings. It's sort of like they're the ultimate result of an indoctrinated person that's completely conformed.
Well, and it's interesting that the masculine falls down and faces that.
Right.
Because not that there aren't women order followers, but, you know, generally speaking, historically, there's much greater likelihood of men being an order follower. And it's also interesting that he really has to fall into that deep unconscious place and face that before he can actually go up and, you know, complete the final task. You know, like that darkness has to be faced.
Yeah, and of course he is the one that is the keeper of the shard. So when he goes down there, he's still clutching that that inner knowing of like he wouldn't be able to do that without it. That's the one thing that is it's the truth as his weapon, his sense of self. He knows who the fuck he is now. He's not afraid to use it as a dagger. And, you know, even though he kind of slips and falls accidentally, you know, he's faced with that. But they don't get him, you know, he manages to get away. And, you know, he escapes into the shaft through this little hatch in the wall, which is, you know, getting back to that shaft. I think it could also really represent the spinal column as well as the chakras, because if you look at it, you've got this big empty shaft that's like a column, and then down below there's this burning pit. So it's kind of like the lower chakras of, you know, the red and orange and the action, you know, that little more masculine kind of thing. And what does he do when he enters the shaft? He's climbing up. And what's up? The crystal is up there. The purple crystal, that third eye chakra awakening, he's he's now ascending it like Kundalini and basically ascending towards that. Yeah, do you have anything to add on that real quick?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely very interesting that you relate it to, you know, the root chakra too, because we see that a lot with, especially like with men who tend to be order followers, that root chakra really tends to be out of imbalance. You know, they're not very grounded, and like that, they're in a very, you know, primitive state of awareness and consciousness. So it's interesting that he has to go down there, you know, and kind of at that level and deal with that, and, you know, start at that foundation and then work up from there in his journey through the castle.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's going to conclude part 2 for this week. We thought we were going to do a 2-parter, but we ended up with like 10 pages of notes each. So we're going to, you know, we want this to really be what it needs to be, you know, take our time and not spare any details, because, you know, what a great rich movie, and obviously our first undertaking of this type of content. We're really enjoying it, having a lot of fun doing it. So this is going to conclude part 2, and of course part 3, the final piece, will be laid down next week. If you like this video, please give it a like, maybe share, tell your friends about it. Again, hit that subscribe button. We've got consistent content every single week, diving deep into the recesses of psychology and the universe, natural law, all the good stuff, all the stuff you need to know. If you haven't yet, I would implore you to check out our initiation package. It's a totally free premium content video series that we put together, covering some basic practices. So if you feel like you want to start taking your spiritual practice to a daily practical levels, learn techniques that you can actually use and start implementing immediately, there's a link below. Check that out. Visit our website, thewizardfactory.com. And this is going to conclude this week's episode. So thanks for stopping by. We'll see you next week for part 3. And until then, be empowered, be inspired, and be encouraged.